Now this video is really worth watching.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a really provocative essay, one that takes a hard, critical look at a moment that changed the world. Using some incredibly strong language, it argues that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't just acts of war, but something much, much darker. So let's get into the author's argument.
So the author kicks things off with this powerful quote from C.S. Lewis, and this really becomes the lens for their entire argument. The claim is that the decision to drop the bomb wasn't born from the heat and chaos of the battlefield. No, it was a cold, calculated decision dreamed up in clean, quiet offices by men who were miles away from the consequences.
All right, so to really get what the author is saying, we first have to understand this core concept they introduce. They call it America's demonic or shadow side. At its heart, the claim is this: the nation's history isn't just dotted with a few mistakes here and there. Instead, the source argues it's a consistent pattern of violence against anyone deemed an other. And this violence, they say, has often been justified by this idea of a special, God-given mission, an idea that's been used to rationalize a lot over the years.
And to back this up, the essay doesn't just point to politicians. It brings in writers, thinkers, people like D.H. Lawrence, Thoreau, Martin Luther King Jr. The author sees these figures as kinds of prophets, people who've been warning for ages about this unmelted national character, a character that, in their view, is defined by its capacity for brutality.
The source actually borrows this idea from the psychologist Carl Jung. The idea that, just like a person, a whole nation can have a shadow, all its repressed, darker instincts. And here's the real kicker. The author claims that while individuals might be good, decent people, when they come together as a mass, a raging monster can be born, and each person just becomes a tiny cell in the monster's body. Okay, so with that pretty heavy framework laid out, the author now zooms in on their main piece of evidence for this national shadow: the atomic bombings themselves. Now, before we even get to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the essay makes a really critical point. The atomic bomb wasn't some sudden, out-of-the-blue escalation. In the author's view, it was just the final step in a campaign that was already targeting civilians. They point directly to General Curtis LeMay and the firebombing raids he led as setting the stage for the intentional killing of non-combatants. And just to give you a sense of the scale of what came before, the source points to the firebombing of Tokyo. We're talking over 100,000 civilian deaths in a single raid. And the author really hammers this point home. This wasn't collateral damage. It was, they argue, a deliberate strategy. And then came the atomic bombs. The essay gives this number, 200,000 to 300,000 dead, and describes the bombings as an intentional holocaust. Now, that's a word they chose very, very carefully to bring to mind an image of mass, systematic slaughter. So this all leads to the big question, right? The one that hangs over this entire piece of history. For years, the story has been that the bombs, as awful as they were a necessary evil, that they saved American lives and ended the war. But was that really the case? The author's answer is a loud, emphatic no. And here you see the two stories side by side. On one hand, the official rationale that we've all heard. And on the other, the author's claim that the bombings weren't really about Japan at all. They argued the war was basically over, and this was really about sending a terrifying message to the Soviet Union. A brutal opening shot in the Cold War.
So how did they back up such a huge claim? Well, they lay out a few key points. They argue Japan was trying to surrender for months, but the U.S. kept making the terms impossible. They point to people like Secretary of State Burns wanting to show results to the Soviets. But maybe the most shocking piece of evidence the author presents is this: a U.S. plan drawn up after Japan surrendered for a surprise nuclear attack on 66 Soviet cities. For the author, this reveals the true motive. So you might be asking yourself, if this version of history is true, according to the author, how is it so completely hidden? Well, that's where the essay gets into what it calls the politics of innocence. The author uses phrases like this one as an example of what they call a magic incantation. The idea is that this belief in America's inherent goodness isn't based on facts. It's just a phrase repeated over and over again, a chant almost, to create an illusion that blinds people to the darker parts of their own history. And this is a really crucial point.
The author doesn't see these events as things that happened way back in the past. They argue that there is a direct, unbroken line from the thinking that okayed the atomic bombs all the way to American foreign policy today. And they say this is a continuous pattern. It's bipartisan, not just a case of a few bad apples or specific presidents.
Okay, so after painting this picture, which, let's be honest, is pretty bleak, the author doesn't just leave us in despair. This final section looks at a possible way forward, a path that starts with a really tough look in the mirror and one surprising ray of hope.
So in this long line of what the essay harshly calls servile killers, it singles out one American president who they say tried to break the mold, John F. Kennedy. He's presented as the exception that proves the rule, the one leader who tried to reject the rule of killer-in-chief. The source maps out this really dramatic change in him. It starts with a meeting with anti-war protesters. Then comes the terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which the author says scared him so badly he became determined to prevent a nuclear war. This all leads up to his famous Apostle of Peace speech. And then, the author makes their most provocative claim of all. They directly connect this turn toward peace to his assassination, just 5 months later. So, what's the takeaway? What are we supposed to do with all this? According to the author, real hope can only come after a terrifying look into the darkness. The path forward, as they see it, has these 3 steps. First, let go of that comforting story of false innocence. Second, actually confront the nation's dark history and its present. And finally, you have to reclaim those shadows. Admit they're there.
And so we end right back where we started, with C.S. Lewis. The author leaves us with this final warning from the Devil's Screwtape. The safest road to hell is the gradual one. It's a slope so gentle you don't even notice you're on it. A really provocative dot to end on. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.